So one of the advanced methods that you can choose for your practical and for your client across your 12-week plan is the interval method. So the interval method is a series of strict work-rest ratios, and you would adapt those work-rest ratios depending on the energy system that you wanted to target. So do think about this in terms of progression and beginner, intermediate, advanced as well. So let's start off with the aerobic energy system at the bottom. So with this one, we would be doing aerobic intervals, which means that we would be working with a work recovery ratio of 1:1. So for example, we would work at 3 to 4 minutes at 6 to 7 on the RPE scale, and then we would recover for 3 to 4 minutes on 5 to 6 on the RPE scale. The gains with regards to this are all aerobic gains, so everything about the cardiorespiratory system, talk about endurance, increased oxygen uptake, talk about fat burning. So remember, when we do these systems for the assessment, we need to introduce that method, let the client know all about that method and why it's beneficial, and then we need to make sure that we tell them all about the work-rest ratios and the intensities as well, and then we need to watch them actually perform that method effectively. The second round of intervals are your lactic intervals. So to get yourself into the lactic zone, we should be working normally on the RPE scale between about an 8 and a 9. In terms of max heart rate, 95 is kind of your cut-off point for this one, because if we're going into the 100%, we're going to be moving into the next round, which would be your creatine phosphate intervals. So still anaerobic, still near maximal, should be feeling between an 8 and a 9. So anything you can do for approximately 30 to 60 seconds will use your lactic acid energy system. Ratio of work to recovery for this one is 1:2. So if we work for 30 seconds, we would expect to actively recover for twice that, 60 seconds. Remember, it is not a cool down. So we're talking about active recovery. So that means I am working to 8 to 9 for 30 seconds, and I am maybe dropping it down just a touch to 7 to 8 maybe for the 60 seconds. Benefits of this one: improved tolerance of lactic acid. The body will be able to get rid and flush out the lactic acid much more effectively. Your lactate threshold, or the point at which you build up lactic acid, will change, and hopefully you'll be able to go a little bit longer as time goes on. This will then in turn make you able to work at high intensities for longer periods of time. So this would be great for things that use a mixture of different levels, like your CrossFits, circuits, HIIT training, this kind of thing. Moving on to the last type of interval, this is your absolute max interval. So this is your creatine phosphate system here. So this is your 100%. So with this one, if we're talking about utilising the creatine phosphate system, your intervals should only be able to last 10 to 15 seconds. They are your max. Your recovery is a ratio of 1:3. So if I work at my max, for example, a crazy burpee for 10 seconds, I should then do passive recovery for 30 seconds, which means I am not moving. So benefits with this one, it's all about challenging the nervous system with this one. So what's going to happen? I'm going to have to speed up my metabolic rate. Afterburn stays through the roof after these two methods of training. It's also going to make the client be able to perform explosive, more high intensity work much more easy, and then it's going to increase your stores of creatine phosphate. And another advanced CV method that we can use is fartlek. Fartlek is a lot more advanced in terms of it can use all three different energy systems. Fartlek is Swedish for speed play, and the purpose is really to shock the body, stop the body from reaching that plateau. So just when that client is used to a bit of, for example, steady state or long slow distance, well, let's get some fartlek in there to challenge them a little bit more. So what we'd expect to see on your practical assessment, we can use a mixture of different machines, and we could also, for example, get some, not body weight, but let's get some things like your burpees, your plyometrics in there. So the idea is, what the assessor wants to see for this one is that random approach. So it could be, for example, treadmill, 5 minutes, nice steady, let's go 6 to 7 on the RPE scale, boom, let's get into some burpees, brilliant, let's kind of touch on the creatine, phosphate and lactic systems. Okay, now we're going to go back onto the row machine. I want you to feel like you're on about an 8 on the RPE scale. Good, steady movements. We're just going to do that until you reach failure. So it's basically the PT is assessing and observing the client, and based on what they're seeing in front of them, they're either sticking with it and pushing them, or they know when to call it a day and move them on to the next exercise. So for your assessment, you could have a range of 2 to 3 different exercises planned for this, and just be aiming to kind of move your client randomly from one to the other. You could do this on the same piece of kit as well. It could be that you choose a cycle and you're just really going to hammer home and be very clear about those changes in intensity and the durations. For this one, an element of planning would be used. So example, what kind of exercises and which pieces of kit am I actually going to use for this? But then it could be very much about you just gauging how the client is performing, assessing them, getting feedback from them, and then just moving them on when you're ready to move them on. So this is how your fartlek should look in terms of, we've got a right mixture here. We've got 8 on the RPE, down to 7, back up to 10, down to 5, up to 8, down to 6, to 10. So this is what the assessor wants to see on the day, that if you talk about fartlek, you understand that it is a random approach, that it is aimed to avoid a plateau, to shock the body. It's going to be a mixture of all different intensities and so on and so forth. Because it can use all 3 energy systems, then talk to the client about the benefits of that. Now, we've talked about intervals already, so we talked about the benefits of the creatine phosphate system. So if you've got some CP working there, wow, this is brilliant, it's going to be able to work in a much more powerful way. You're going to increase stores of creatine phosphate system. But in addition to that, you're also going to improve your lactate threshold and flush out your lactic acid. Oh, but in addition to that, we are also working on your aerobic gains. So with this one, do remember with this one though, we shouldn't expect to see the same duration for fartlek as we would for steady state or long slow distance. Steady state long slow distance is a lower intensity, therefore we would expect to be able to do that for longer, unlike your fartlek. So say for example you chose for your assessment steady state, we would expect to be hearing things like 20-30 minutes, not that you're actually going to do the full 20 to 30 minutes. If you chose fartlek, we're expecting your 10 to 15s coming in, just to kind of demonstrate that the intensity is going to be higher, therefore your duration needs to be reduced. Okay, we have 2 more advanced CV methods that you can choose from for your assessment. The first one is called long slow distance, or LSD. It's also referred to as a steady state or continuous method of training, more favoured by, for example, the beginner or long distance endurance-based goals. So this one, I've just drawn a hill here. So the way, as it describes in the title here, we're literally going to do a nice build up into the aerobic curve. So for example, gradually building them up between a 5 and a 6 on the RPE scale. And then I'm just using an example of 20 minutes for this peak here. So this is a long slow distance run, for example. So for the main duration of that peak, it's a steady state. We aren't going to be lifting things up and down like we would with intervals or fartlek. It is just literally that steady state. Usual recovery, probably 5 to 6 before you move them onto your cool down. Gains that we'd be talking about with this one here are predominantly aerobic based gains. So the idea of this is to just build them up, get them in the steady state aerobic zone, and then talk about all your aerobic benefits. So again, this would be where you'd be talking about fat burning, endurance, increased oxygen uptake, the heart will become bigger and stronger, the blood pressure is going to reduce. So when you're actually selling this method, make sure you talk about how it's going to be executed in terms of, I'm going to build you up, then I'm going to keep you at a steady state over a long period of time, and then we're going to do some recovery. Be clear on the intensities. This is all about aerobic. We shouldn't be hitting above the 8s on your steady state or your LSD. Another method, which can be a very advanced method. Now with this one's called tempo training, but it has a couple of other names as well. So it can also be referred to as lactate threshold training, and it can also be referred to as OBLA. So OBLA stands for the onset of blood lactic accumulation. So we can see there that key term lactic is coming up all of the time. So with this one, looks very different to your steady state. So it might be, so this is obviously for a very conditioned client. So it might be that we build you up to that 8, putting you in the lactic zone, so between 8 and 9. And we just literally, we keep you up there, just under that threshold, as long as we possibly can. So it could be that we work just directly underneath that lactate threshold for say 3 to 4 minutes the first time that we actually try this method of training. There is no set recovery in terms of when we actually go back into the next tempo, as it were. You may find some set examples online, but in general what we do is keep them in the lactic for as long as we can, just underneath that lactic. We then drop them down and give them some recovery in the aerobic training zone. When they're ready, we take them back up and we try and get them to stay in that lactic zone a little bit longer. So over time, for example, Paula Radcliffe did a lot of training like this. So she does quite significant distances. So what she did was, she didn't work here, she worked here. So basically she was able to run that race in the lactate zone for pretty much the majority of that race. So benefits of tempo training are, it will move the lactate threshold. So in terms of this one here, it could be we start to kind of really build up that lactic acid within a couple of minutes the first time we try this. As we continue with it over the forthcoming weeks, it could be that we don't start building that lactic acid up until kind of 5 or 6 minutes. So what that means is we definitely improve tolerance to lactic acid, definitely can flush it out, and the lactate threshold will also move along as we go.